Up, gang? Thanks for listening to the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson. And today we've got Gabby Magnuson,
Hey.
Alex Audie,
G'day.
Celia McDowell,
Hi.
and Hunter Marston.
Hey.
So just two quick hits before we get into everything. One, this is becoming like a recurring theme, tragically. Senator Joe Manchin, enemy of all things progressive at this point, he voted with Republicans to block $4 billion for a UN climate fund and divert it to Pentagon R&D, to DARPA. And Senator Tom Cotton, who's a MAGA conservative, he argued specifically that this needed to happen because we needed the money to fight China, right? So last year, Joe Manchin also blocked Biden's Build Back Better legislation because at the time he was saying we couldn't afford to do infrastructure investment because we needed the money to fight China and Russia, which is, of course, like bizarro logic, but whatever. So this is a pattern, right? And it reflects the military Keynesianism bargain that Democrats have made for most of the past 70 years. So like the theory for Democrats is supposed to be that, this goes back to the early Cold War, they support high defense budgets, and in the modern context, they support China rivalry. They reiterate that rhetoric, they support that position, they validate it and legitimate it. And then in exchange, they're supposed to get public goods, right? Infrastructure, a welfare state. And the way this works out in practice, it's like the Republicans are fucking Lucy with the football and Charlie Brown. Like America's political economy has never, except for a couple rare moments, never really worked out this bargain the way Democrats think it's supposed to, right? Like we're the fucking suckers. We continuously go on to the Republicans' terrain, we accept their premises, and then they austeritize us. They say, well, we can't afford to do that shit, right? And so the public good stuff always gets fucking lopped off and narrowed, and then all we're left is this like military shit. And that's how we get the military Keynesian uber national security state, where a Democrat, Biden, puts $813 billion down on the Pentagon, more than even Trump, who was a hyper-militarist, right? So it's tragic and upsetting, but it's like of a pattern at this point, right? So I just wanted to flag it because once again, this militarist mindset is contributing to an outcome that is ultimately really unstrategic. We're completely mismatched with the kinds of threats that we face. We are taking money away from dealing with the existential problem, the problem of our time, and routing it toward this like ethno-nationalist boondoggle on behalf of the Pentagon, right? Very problematic.
Van, just maybe for the listeners, where does this phrase military Keynesianism come from? Is that your own creation?
It's not my own creation. There's a guy, Michael Breens, who is at Yale. He had a book called For Might and Right, or For Might and For Right. But it was kind of about how ever since the 1960s, in the midst of the Vietnam War, Democrats and Republicans established this bipartisan bargain for a national political economy that was built around the military-industrial complex. And so it was using military spending as a way to lower unemployment, a way to increase aggregate demand. And it was a sucker move because ultimately it created conditions to embrace neoliberalism and to gut the welfare state and to disempower unions. So like it put Democrats on a terrain where they had to constantly like sacrifice their side of shit. But the military stuff always stayed very buoyant, right? So that's what military Keynesianism yielded. But the first time I saw the term was in that guy's book. And it floats around on the left too. Like I've seen other people use it too. So it's not mine, unfortunately.
Cool.
So second quick hit, maybe it's a longer hit, I don't know. Hunter flagged a story that Politico ran about the Biden administration's China strategy, and it quoted an anonymous China expert close to the administration saying that, quote, the China strategy is basically Trump plus with sophistication and allies and partners, right? And I think some people saw this and viewed the quote kind of innocently, or like, well, yeah, it's Trump plus and more sophisticated. What's wrong with that? That is a fucking broken system. So first, I have 2 points on this, and I have a feeling Hunter has something to say too. First, Trump's China policy, it was reductive. It was based on some like really shaky assumptions, and it was, of course, horribly executed. Even fans of confrontation thought it was horribly executed, right? There was never really a China strategy beyond investing all your resources and all your chips into zero-sum gaming, this other great power, right? And looking back, it's not even clear that we achieved anything positive. Like, we didn't really cut off China's influence, right? We shit the bed on Hong Kong. We shit the bed on Xinjiang. We made ourselves unbelievably unpopular. We made Taiwan into even more of a pawn than it was, right? And mostly, like, we just inflamed rivalry and arms racing. And so, like, the idea that the Biden administration should do that China policy, but then add even more to the defense budget and then call it a day, like, it's so intellectually bankrupt, right? It shows how captive DC is to groupthink and fads and fucking Republican talking points. Like, the foreign policy apparatus of the Democratic Party is in shambles intellectually. It's compromised intellectually, right? Like, to do a Trump plus China policy in the context of Republican vote rigging at home, conspiracy theories, the hate mongering, in the context of a worsening oligarchy at home, Biden's foreign policy people are making themselves into nothing more than caretakers for some future far-right government with like an ethno-nationalist anti-China project. It's fucking sad, right? So I said on Twitter, like, my mission in life is to make Democrats think for themselves again about foreign policy and stop being fucking losers who just copy and paste Republican homework. Be strategic, right? Recognize when you're on a path that's counterproductive. But like, even more than that, just recognize when you're doing dirt on behalf of this like fascist cadre within the GOP, right? The Dems are doing their bit to make dystopia for all of us, and we gotta fix it. But the second point on this is that for people who are not aware, there's an inner circle of think tank pundits in DC, scholars even, who are mostly conservative. They're people who are funded by defense contractors, and they include people at Heritage and at AEI, which are both conservative think tanks, right? They get draft previews of internal Biden administration strategy documents before they're ever released. They get a pre-consultation, right? It's part of like a socialization strategy, like to get internal buy-in. And so if you wonder why, and other administrations did this too, but we're in a new era, obviously, right? But I raise it because if like you wonder why Biden's foreign policy is so same with Trump and so frozen and unmoved by the like radically changing political situation at home and abroad, some of the reason for that stasis is because the people being consulted on the strategies, it's the same old crowd of unaccountable, groupthinky elites on the take. You know, how do I know this? Because I was one of those insiders until I started speaking critically about the Biden administration's position on things. And you're not allowed to fucking do that if you're an insider, right? So it's all a bit upsetting, you know.
Is it one of those things where the administration kind of like hears buzzwords and they're like, yeah, go go listen to this guy. He's hitting like the right stuff. Is it a lot of that, or is it more just like
It's not, well, it depends on how well the buzzwords fit with their priors or with what everyone else thinks. Like, people don't like to get into fights or disagreements. It's much easier bureaucratically and intellectually to just copy and paste from other people.
Okay.
It's to go with the current. And there's a tradition too, a generation long tradition of Democrats seeing a virtue in national security bipartisanship. And that's not a virtue anymore. It's not a virtue when the other side is completely fucking untethered from democracy. You're engaged in a hyper militarist project at that point. And so that's like something we have to be aware of, that we are not used to being aware of, what at least the insiders, so it's troubling. This was your tweet, Hunter.
Yeah, well, I mean, you nailed it there. I don't have a whole lot to add. I think my overriding takeaway here is that the imbalance in U.S.-Asia strategy remains fundamentally the same. And this, I think, persists from the Obama administration's pivot or rebalance, which ultimately ended up focusing on the security posture in the region above and beyond trade policy. Unfortunately, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was sort of the economic pillar component of the rebalance, ended up falling through because I think the Obama administration, in a nutshell, sort of ended up lending too little, too late in terms of political capital to get that across the finish line. But that aside, the Trump administration, I think, exacerbated this imbalance, as you and I have written about, in terms of focusing exclusively on the military dimension in checking China's rise, and obviously adding a lot of sort of racialized clash of civilizations narrative to that, a theme we've spoken on before. And then essentially neglecting entirely the U.S. economic strategy or statecraft in the region, which is really what Asian partners want. I mean, I'm sort of separating out the developed economies of Northeast Asia to a point, although Japan certainly was a prominent advocate of U.S. participation in the CPTPP. But if you look at Southeast Asia, right, these countries don't want exactly increased U.S. military presence, and they certainly don't want that alone, because it's seen as inherently destabilizing if it's absent an economic engagement strategy. And so economic engagement, which the U.S. does well in terms of private sector activity in the region. The U.S. remains the largest provider of foreign direct investment in Southeast Asia, for instance, but without a free trade deal, a multilateral platform to embed the U.S. in the region and allow it to set rules and norms, it just looks like it's there to provide a military check against China, which is unappealing to partners because then it puts them in an awkward position. And so I think that this China strategy, as Blinken was supposed to outline in a speech at George Washington University, which actually didn't happen because he got COVID, so we don't really know what's going to come of it. But essentially, to describe this new China strategy as Trump plus sophistication and allies and partners, I think it's a terrible way to frame the strategy, because you always want to differentiate your strategy from your predecessors. But B, it just fundamentally reifies that imbalance that I'm getting at. It's all security and no trade. And right now, ASEAN partners are in Washington for this US-ASEAN Special Summit. The Biden administration said it was going to unveil this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework sometime in May. It's continually postponed that. So really, ASEAN partners have no economic component to latch onto. And what they're left with is probably, we'll see what comes of this, but how can we enlist partners in our strategy to contain China and push back against Russian aggression, which is not something that partners in Asia universally support.
Yeah. I think if you don't have a theory of political economy, you can't actually have a strategy. You can have militarism, you can have cheap talk, you can have fluff. Can't have a strategy if you don't have a perspective on political economy, even if it's a bad one. Like, even if you're just pure neoliberal or whatever, at least you've got, what is it, the fucking Big Lebowski thing? Like, say what you will about the tenets of National Socialism, at least it's an ethos. There's like a little bit of that there, like at least the neoliberals have a fucking perspective, These guys don't have anything. Anyway, it's trouble. Celia, did you have something?
Oh, I was just wondering, like, have they like changed the rhetoric around it at all to make it seem like it's this whole new strategy instead of just copying what's been done before?
The rhetoric is more restrained. I mean, like the
framework,
quote
though?
from the the quote from Politico mentioned that it was like Trump plus and more sophisticated, and that sophisticated part is supposed to be a gesture toward like we're so much more competent and coherent than those guys. What they're really talking about, though, I think, is like it's not the fire and fury gratuitous, we're going to set the world on fire. Like Biden's rhetoric is just so dialed in and restrained, but it's also very just pure fluff. Like it's very much throwback to like the Obama years, which, some of us would like to like go relive those moments, but it's just a different environment, a different world. So like a lot of the rhetoric is more Obama-y, but in a context where it doesn't quite make sense anymore.
Old wine, new cask.
Yes. All right. So what's this next segment called? True or false? Who's got it?
Two lies and a truth. All right. Sometimes
right.
I read the prompts that like Jake sets up, and I'm like, aw, he definitely wrote this. Do you know what I mean? So I'll start with the first one. Following the recent electoral success of the son of Philippine dictator Ferdinand Marcos, Alessandra Mussolini announces her rerun in the Italian general election in 2023. Statement number two. Poland announces a general amnesty for Russian and Belarusian political refugees. And 3, the United Kingdom signed security declarations with both Sweden and Finland among talks of both nations joining the NATO alliance. Hot takes. Can you tell which one's true?
Wait, it's 2 true and 1 false, right?
2 lies, 1 true.
Shit. I got it backwards when I was listening to them.
You want me to go again? I can do it again.
So the first one, I'm almost certain is false. Like Mussolini's kid's not. Yeah.
Rerunning for the Italian general election. Okay.
Okay, so that's false. What was the third one?
The UK signs security declarations with both Sweden and Finland among talks of both nations joining the NATO alliance.
So this is hot and brewing, and there are talks, and the UK is talking with Sweden and Finland. I'm going to say it's false, though, because I don't know that there's been something signed.
Oh, but there has been.
Oh, no.
We finally got you.
First time getting got. Okay.
Well done.
Yeah.
Wait, so what was the true one? The second was
the third one. The UK has been signing security declarations.
So the false one was the second one, which was
Poland announces a general amnesty for Russian and Belarusian political refugees.
So that's not true.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, my streak had to end at some point. Okay.
This one was tough though. Like when I was reading it the first time, I was genuinely like, wait, which one was the true one? Well, it definitely wasn't the Mussolini one, but
yeah. Yeah, man. Okay. All right. Well, there we go.
We're learning things every day.
Okay. Stay off Twitter. Let me pull these up real quick.
Just quickly, Van, do you know that you're live on Twitch right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's fine. Nobody watches it because I don't send out the link. Like nobody.
Yeah, just making sure.
Yeah.
Join our Twitch channel.
Yeah, we're live streaming on Twitch too, but nobody knows we're on Twitch, so like it doesn't really. If you live stream and no one's there to see it, did you really live stream?
Celia, have you got this on Instagram Live too?
We're not on Instagram Live. I can put us on Instagram Live though. I'll make a boomerang soon.
How does that work with audio?
I don't know. You guys would just all have to do like a little boomerang motion. Yeah.
All right. So for Stay Off Twitter this week, I just have one from Max Abrams, who's a professor. He specializes in counterterrorism stuff. And he just says about the MAGA new right guy, J.D. Vance, who is running for Senate in Ohio. He won the primary, and he won it by like emulating Trump. He's the infamous guy who wrote Hillbilly Elegy, but then turned far right and became like a full-on MAGA shithead, whatever. But he says about J.D. Vance's win in Ohio, he goes, J.D. Vance's win will only reinforce the alignment of foreign policy restrainers and the GOP, while the Democratic Party will become even more the party of war. And this is an interesting take. It's one that is not super like funny, and I don't even think it's actually true necessarily, but it's interesting food for thought. A misread here that I think he's making, which is common, is to think that the new right, MAGA right, are not militarists. To think that they're restrainers because they don't want to go after Putin or something, right? And that's not the case at all, right? We talked about this a few weeks ago on the pod. The far right is super militarist, and their project of militarism is just like laser focused on yellow and brown people. So it's got Iran in their crosshairs, and it's got China in their crosshairs, and it's got marginal and minority communities in the US in their crosshairs, right? And the domestic and the international are connected, right? They don't want to reduce the defense budget. They don't want to take their eye off of China rivalry. They don't want to end the relationship between the military and the militarization of the police. They don't want to break that culture of bro culture of like the militarization of the police, right? They don't want to end the national security surveillance state. So like the new right is not, or the far right, whatever you want to fucking call them, they're not restrainers, you know? They're restrainers on the specific case of Putin and in the case of nation building. So like, you know, endless projects like Afghanistan. But that's it. They're willing to drop bombs on anybody, including their own people, Americans, you know? And the part that is like more true is that, so the GOP is not going to become the party of restraint. I don't see that happening. They're becoming militarists, even more so. The Democratic Party is the de facto party of war at this point because they've allowed themselves to be defined in relation to the Republicans as like the more, you know, moderate, competent version of Republicans on foreign policy in particular. And this is, of course, a losing hand. We've talked about this many times. But they've also, the Democrats, like a lot of neocons who were the Uberhawks who got us into the Iraq War, a lot of neocons have left the Republican Party and are now like praising and cheering Biden. And they're part of the group that consults on the Biden strategy documents and stuff. And like the neocons have started drifting into the Republican Party even more than they were before. And so like, I think the part that might be true here is that the Democratic Party is becoming more and more the party of war. But it's like the Terminator thing, no fate but what we make, you know? The Democratic Party actually has internal contestation. It depends on who the standard bearer of the party is, who's the leader at any given moment, right? I would like to think that 2024, if Biden doesn't run, there's going to be some like serious progressive energy for a different kind of Democratic Party. That's what I'm banking and hoping on, and that's what my existence is basically tied to at this point. So we'll see. Like right now, the Democrats do look like the party of war. I think he's right about that. But it was just an interesting tweet, like a lot of food for thought here.
So Van, real quickly, I know you just said all your hopes banking on, you know, that. Is that actually going to happen, you reckon? Do you think there's any perspectives that you're like, oh, this will...
There are a bunch of progressive, like, politicos who are positioning themselves to run for president in 2024 if Biden doesn't run. Bernie has not ruled it out. It's a possibility, even though he's, you know, obviously a very advanced age at this point.
Is he older or younger than Biden?
I don't know, but he's fucking old, if I'm being honest, you know?
He's got the kids behind him.
Rokana's young, and Rokana has been positioning himself to get that big tech money. And he's a restrainer on foreign policy. Like he's aligned with the Justice Democrats. I've heard some stuff about like AOC possibly, even though like a lot of people hate her. So and Warren is the overturning of Roe versus Wade has like really energized Warren. So it's not impossible that she comes through. Who knows? It all depends on whether Biden decides to run or not in 2024.
I can't see him running again personally.
Yeah.
I mean, what will his stump speeches sound like at that point?
Yeah, seriously.
Hand off the baton.
Yeah. All right, so that's the only tweet I've got this week. You guys got a couple others?
Yeah. So the first one is from Nick Bisley, who's the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at La Trobe in Australia. And so his tweet is just commenting on a Australian Financial Review piece, kind of going over the whole Solomon Islands stuff that's been going on for the last like month or so. We've talked about in the last few episodes, I think. And so he's basically saying that. So the piece is saying that for 2 generations since the end of World War II, Australia has squandered the chance to build deep and enduring relations with neighbours in the South Pacific. And his comment is that tragedy is that experts in the region have been saying this for decades and roundly ignored by the elites, and a hideous blend of ignorance, complacency, and paternalism.
Yeah. When I first saw this, it triggered some thoughts of agreement, and I can't think of them now. All I can say is like, yes, I agree. But also we've beat this horse a few times, so.
Yeah, the only thing I would add now, having had some conversations over recent weeks with friends in Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT here, is that I think this is very well understood at the sort of staff level below the politicos and political leadership. It's just that it's never been a priority for federal government in Australia, unfortunately. And I think that paternalism really is what endures here. So you don't see outreach based on the interests of Solomon Islands or of Pacific Island states, which would really reinforce some goodwill for Australia. Unfortunately, it's just not on the agenda. But I think given the recent kerfuffle over the Solomon Islands, perhaps it's a wake-up call, and like this message says, too little, too late.
That's what gives the game away, right? The paternalism. How would you know that you're just being paternalistic, which is to say hierarchical, marginalizing, right? You're basically exploiting a situation. You're treating them as pawns and objects. How would you know that that's the case? Well, one way that you would know is that you don't do a fucking thing for this country, and then when something happens, when they do their own shit that you don't like, you fucking freak out and act like they shouldn't have any right to do that, and it's a failure that this has happened. Like, that's a bad fucking sign, It's an indicator of the blind spots in being paternalistic, in treating them as if they were some kind of de facto colony. And I saw like some people being like, well, what about Ramsey? What about the Australian mission to the Solomon Islands to like help stabilize the situation when there was civil unrest before a few years back? And it's like, that was a military operation to do nothing more than introduce stability. And the money that flowed to the Solomon Islands for Ramsey was overwhelmingly, and some like very smart scholars in Australia have been the ones to point this out, the money for this mission was overwhelmingly used to pay Australian salaries. It didn't do anything for the country. It just kept them out of a fire, out of like, it's like putting out the fire, but not addressing the conditions that gave rise to the fire in the first place. And so like, that's the best that's happened. And it's when you've got outside powers doing this firefighter thing and they think that's their role, it allows them to act like they're the heroes of the situation, but actually they're just helping perpetuate a situation that's inherently fragile and precarious. And it it cripples the ability to actually address root problems, right? And so like all of that is downstream of relating to them as a people with whom you have solidarity. This notion of a Pacific family is completely false, self-flattering bullshit. It shouldn't be. It should be real. But to be real, you'd have to make evidence of it over decades, right? You can see evidence of real relationships, of solidarity over time. Not because you brought a suitcase full of money, not because you sent troops one time. Like, that's not solidarity. That is paternalism. Okay, so I guess I thought I had a little something to say on this, but
Sweet.
all right.
So the next two tweets kind of go together, which it's kind of funny because they got submitted by two different members of the crew. So the first tweet is from Don Lewis, who was related to the whole Rudy Giuliani and Ukraine situation. So his tweet is, in light of tonight's Roe vs. Wade news, Handmaid's Tale should be mandatory viewing for all before the midterms. And then the next tweet from Cora Harrington is that so many people citing The Hunger Games and The Handmaid's Tale today, forgetting the meta-critique of both books is that they are founded on the concept of what if we treated white people the way we already treated people of color.
Yeah. So the overturning of Roe versus Wade, like it's an attack on feminism and it's an assertion of patriarchy, right? And patriarchy is part of white supremacy. There's not like some gender blind version of white supremacy. And so these things, especially as experienced historically, like they go together. So when you see a moment like this, I mean, first of all, the right has been building toward this for decades. It's not like it's been a fucking secret, like that's why they're obsessed with the Supreme Court, because they want to overturn shit like Roe versus Wade. They probably want to overturn fucking Brown versus Board of Education, right? Desegregated schools. So like when they do this, right, you should turn to dystopian fiction as a guide, like alongside history. Like, I think it's totally important to remind ourselves about how dark this shit can get, right? We just baby stepped a little bit more toward Handmaid's Tale as our reality, right? So let's get that reminder, because it should galvanize us, at least like the negative motivation, right, to protect what rights we've gained, what progress we've gained. But then like the second tweet, the rejoinder from this Cora Harrington, it's absolutely true that the fear of having your like reproductive rights reproduced or surveilled, right, and policed, and to be on, like, to have to be a criminal to make your own choices with your life, and that process, which is targeting women now, it doesn't stop at women. And what people are seeing is how Black and brown communities are already treated, right? There's some other good sub-threads to this one, pointing out examples of how what people are afraid of happening to women is what's been going on in the hood for a long time, right? And so the thing that bugs me about, like, this is a good insight. The thing that bugs me about the way the tweet is phrased is like it's anti-solidarist. Like, I'm not a woman, I don't like it. I'm not going to be getting an abortion in my lifetime, but these struggles are all connected, because the end game for the far right is all connected, and they lose when we are in solidarity across struggles, right? When we have different fights that we recognize are connected and that unifies us. That's how we form a bloc that has more votes than them, that can bring more pressure to bear than they can. And that's how we get change, right? The civil rights movement and the nuclear freeze movement were connected, and the anti-Vietnam War movement and the ecological movement and the original first two waves of feminism movements, those were all connected, but they were their own siloed issues, but we made progress on one that helped us make progress on the other. Like the tactics of civil rights in the South, boycotts and stuff, was what was brought into nuclear abolition and free speech movements and the anti-Vietnam War movements. Like, it's not just that like we cooperated together across struggles. We couldn't have advanced one without advancing the other. And so that works in reverse too. When we have one form of social progress challenged, it's going to hurt other forms of social progress. First, they come for the women, right? Or first, they come for the Black and brown communities. Then they come for the women. That's kind of where we're at now. Next, it's going to be the fucking Asians and the Jews and the communists, right? And which there aren't even fucking communists, the socialists, right? And so, like, that's how it works. That's fascism in action. So we have to all see the connectedness of these issues and recognize that like an attack on women is an attack on us, you know? And so like Handmaid's Tale, yes, but also recognize that like the thing that we're worried about here with overturning Roe versus Wade is the kind of thing in an existential level that pre-exists in certain parts of the United States, right? Which means we also have to stay united with Black Lives Matter and such, right? So yeah, I thought these two tweets went together, even though they were like antagonistic, sort of. First time we talked about abortion on the show. All right.
Is that it for tweets?
Yeah. Kept it short-ish.
Cool. Let's move into Armchair. All right. For this week's Armchair Analysis, we've got a piece on CNN by Simone McCarthy called Why the Philippines Election Could Be a Win for China. So to contextualize here, Philippines just had an election, national election, and Marcos Jr., familiarly known as Bong Bong, the son of late dictator Ferdinand Marcos, just won national elections. A lot to say about this, a lot of feelings. This is, this election just took place, so the election results are probably still coming in.
Oh, you just cut out, bro.
Oh, did I? Is it?
Yeah,
Maybe I should just
we didn't hear.
unplug the mic.
Yeah, we didn't hear what you just said, and we still don't hear you.
Okay, is that better?
This is why we don't do live shows, by the way.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Where do I need to backtrack to?
You had lots of feels. That was like as far as you got.
Lots of feels about this. Absolutely. First things first. The fact that the Philippines just elected the son of a dictator they ousted in 1986 in a people power movement is remarkable. And it's also troubling because Marcos Jr. has, I'm sorry if you're hearing a baby crying in the background. Baby just got home. Anyways, another reason we don't do a live podcast. Marcos Jr. has essentially whitewashed the history of his father's rule over the country for several decades by framing this election in terms of authoritarian nostalgia, harping on the economic growth, which is very arguable. Historians have contested that, as well as the general stability that endured under Marcos Sr.'s rule. And the kleptocracy and the erosion of rule of law during that time were what led to the Marcos ouster and the people power movement that brought about Philippine democracy. So it's shocking that the country would go and elect the dictator's son, who's now trying to recast his father's rule in such flowery, positive terms.
Yeah.
But So apps or separating the sort of democratic erosion we're seeing ongoing. I think it's important to say first off that Marcos's election victory, the margin of votes, is very significant and much wider than Duterte's election. So analysts were, sort of taken aback by Duterte's election in 2016. At the time, Duterte won high 30%, 38% or something of the votes. And we've talked about this before, but the Philippines electoral system, you don't need a majority of votes. You only need a plurality. So it ends up forming governments that aren't hugely representative of the people. Marcos Jr., by contrast, I think won nearly 60% of the vote. So not quite double that of Duterte, but it's a clear election. He really picked up enough votes to make this a convincing election win.
Well, it's worth mentioning too, like it was a neck and neck-ish race until he took on Duterte's daughter as vice president.
Right.
And that was when the lead jumped.
That's right. So Sarah Duterte is the vice president. She also won a commanding share of votes.
I'd also like to add really quickly, he also encouraged part of the, sorry, let me try and re-say this. Yeah, actually, Hunter, I might let you finish first before I say anything, before I jump in.
Sure. Yeah, I'm just going to make a few broad points here. So, getting over the shock, we have to acknowledge that Philippine voters did vote overwhelmingly for Marcos Jr. It's their election. It's not my place to criticize their choice. But that aside, a lot of the articles we're seeing come out of Western media like CNN tend to frame this in terms of, I was going to say Duterte's foreign policy, Marcos Jr.'s foreign policy and leaning toward China, which I think is a bit premature. Marcos Jr. did not participate in many election debates, and he hasn't given a ton of interviews to indicate what his foreign policy might look like. So I think this reflects a bit of Washington's angst over Southeast Asian elections these days, with the China framing dominating discussion here. But on that note, I would emphasize we actually don't know much about his foreign policy. He's sort of presented a mixed package of policies like Duterte did before coming to power. But if we look back over past Philippine presidencies from the 90s, you have Gloria Arroyo, who came to power supporting the U.S. Occupation of Iraq and military invasion, sending Philippine troops and personnel there. And then towards the end of her administration in the mid-2000s, actually being much closer to China. You have Benigno Aquino, her successor, who was much more willing to have a pragmatic relationship with China early in his administration. By the end of his term, he's aligned the Philippines very closely with Washington, signed an enhanced defense cooperation agreement. And then, of course, Duterte essentially bandwagoning Manila with Beijing, and then eventually slowly coming back around to the U.S. alliance. So my point is that we don't know what any Philippine leader is going to do based on sort of election rhetoric and what comes early on in the administration. It's still anyone's guess. What I would commend here, I want to give a shout out to a piece by Phil Hymans in Bloomberg. I only read this after selecting this piece's armchair analysis. But Phil's excellent piece touches on the role of clans and power politics, political dynasties in shaping Philippine elections. So Marcos Jr. very skillfully managed to get the backing of important clans in Cebu and elsewhere to really guarantee his election outcome ahead of time. So shout out to Phil's piece, which I think captured a lot of the nuance going on behind the scenes and doesn't frame this discussion purely in terms of what will Marcos's China policy be, or what will he do with the U.S. alliance. I'll leave it at that. Lots more to discuss.
Yeah. Gabby, do you have thoughts?
I think, and I don't mean this as like a major criticism, what Hunter is saying, like for sure. I think, I know a lot of media outlets are reporting, and I've like seen it all over Twitter. I've seen it like splashed on like the news front pages about like confusion over how the Philippines like could, as Hunter mentioned, like overwhelmingly have voted for like Marcos, right? But I think something that also needs to be said is the difficulty in which a lot of areas of, for example, like Lenny supporters, because leading up to this election, there were like hundreds of of thousands of people like flooding the streets. You were seeing pink everywhere, and that's not just because
Manila, right? So
yeah,
urban
Manila.
middle class voters, yeah.
Yeah, because yes, Marcos definitely was influential in like the down south, where it's a bit confusing, definitely, because the promise really lied in him. A lot of it was like, oh, that like 10 billion that we stole from like the Philippines, we're gonna give it like back to you guys, right? Which it's kind of, you feel kind of like sad. Like there's a level of pity where you're like, oh, he's really taking advantage of like people, but at the end of the day, your pity can only go so far because it's like, oh my God. I know because like my parents kind of lived through this like sort of thing. I think, but with the voting still kind of like happening, a lot of areas in Manila, because Manila is very like densely populated as well. A lot of like my family friends I know were spending about like 6-7 hours like waiting in line for machines that weren't working. My mom never got like her ballot, for example, and a lot of like overseas, because there's a lot of like Filipino immigrants, for example, they haven't got their ballots either, right? Which is kind of like, that was suspect. And then the way the graphs were, because there's already like a lot of as Hunter mentioned, like whitewashing of the history, right? Like people are actually being fooled, like grandmas who like lived through the dictatorship. My mom was telling me the story where they're like, oh, during like the dictatorship they were giving out like this kind of bread, and now these grandmas want to be like, oh, we want to relive like this dictatorship period, this propaganda bread, by giving it to their children too. And it's like, that's fucking bonkers. But yeah, I feel like a lot of like media outlets and stuff kind of show that, oh man, that's whack that like the Philippines are all like, a lot of Filipinos are voting for Marcos, when in reality it's kind of like, I don't know, it's a lot of the voting is suspect. But I'm not just saying that because of my inclinations. It's just kind of like,
No, this
it's
is
hard to call it.
I raised this on Twitter, and then I deleted it because I delete a lot of the shit that I post on Twitter actually. But I don't know, like there's like an inner psychology there that I have not contemplated. But this was one of the things that I like posted and deleted. But I think it's because like I didn't want it to be misinterpreted, and it lent itself to misinterpretation. But like I've seen so many accusations of like vote rigging, that this not being a free and fair election, that there were malfunctions, that even if the process went smoothly, there's so many votes that are unaccounted for still at a purely like administrative and clerical level, that like it was just too soon to declare such a definitive win. And the margin of victory became the excuse to do that. And so like I have no standing to be able to like adjudicate that stuff either way. So I'm just like, whatever. But the idea that it was a free and fair election seems like questionable, and yet it's unsurprising to me that a majority would vote for a guy who is basically a strongman with a legacy of authoritarian kleptocracy. I mean, like that is not surprising, because like I think there's this confusion that like, well, if you have a large masses of poor people, that's where a revolution comes from. Or it's like people who are desperate are the ones who are going to go and demand change. That's not how it works at all. Bourgeoisie demand change. Like you get people to like comfortable and their bellies full, then they can seek more. Then they want to defend their rights more. It's when you're impoverished and you're without and you're in a desperate situation, which is what oligarchies create, right? You can't have the wealth of the 40 families in the Philippines unless you have large impoverished rural areas in the Philippines. Those things have to coexist. And this is of a pattern with other countries too, including the United States to a degree, in a different way. But like that dynamic is vulnerable to authoritarian demagoguery. It's vulnerable to exploitation of your like fond memories of the propaganda bread, right? It like dictatorships also deliver public goods. They just deliver them selectively and undemocratically, right? And those public goods, the way they deliver them is strategic and for their personal enrichment, you know? And so like, it feels like a little scary to me and tragic, but like not super surprising given the conditions that Duterte not just inherited, but like made worse, right? The political economic terrain of the Philippines lends itself to this. And so the only way you can remedy this is by unfucking that, right? Unkleptocratizing it, de-oligarchizing it, right? And that's going to be really hard to do, particularly when we, in an economic order structured as it is, right? Which is why root causes have to go back to like, you have to have a theory of political economy. Got to have an argument there, right? Otherwise, it's just, this is going to keep kind of happening, right? Yeah.
If you don't mind me asking this, just both for Van and Hunter, you know, as mentioned, they haven't really pulled through with like any promises or like plans in terms of their like foreign policy. Just getting back to the original like article that we pitched. So between like Marcos' presidency, Duterte as his VP, you have Arroyo literally like in the House of Representatives again. Like, do you see like any positives to this, or like any inclinations about where they're going to go? I know you said it's a bit like, but I don't know, the kind of people they're filling up with their government at the moment, it seems kind of intense.
I'm trying to think of like, is there any country in the world that is a kleptocracy that is against China? It's an open question. It's a serious question, like open question. But I think the answer is no, there's not. Everywhere there's a kleptocracy, they're on the take from China.
Van, I thought we were calling, or perhaps we were talking about oligarchy, but I thought we were referring to the United States as a kleptocracy occasionally.
The problem is you can't, in the modern system, you can't have an oligarchy without theft, like scale, right? You have to have illegal siphoning of money. Like oligarchy creates a system of corruption. It's the kleptocracy, because like they conflate into each other at a certain point, which is kind of where we are with the US now. But yeah, I like thinking of the US more as an oligarchy than a kleptocracy. But there is a good book by Sarah Chase that just came out, who had advised Bernie, I think, for a little while. And she used to work for actually the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And she wrote a book about kleptocracy in Afghanistan and how that really fucked over our operations there. But she just wrote a book about kleptocracy in America. And so she points out how that's very much the case. I feel like you get more explanatory leverage out of thinking of it as an oligarchy. But in any case, they coincide, you know. And so the 40 families thing in the Philippines is like the fact that you can have like a landed aristocracy that makes it oligarchic, you know, and the fact that they have like legislative power on top of that, oligarchy, ruled by the rich few, right? On behalf of the rich few. But yeah, like what Marcos's dad was doing was like at a scale of fucking graft that was just unbelievable. Like that was again, they shade into each other. Like that was pure kleptocracy, you know? Yeah. So are we going to go back to that since he won't apologize? I don't know.
Well, I think we very much are, you know, not out of it yet. So ironically, I don't know if ironically is the right word, but for whatever it's worth, Marcos Jr. presently can't enter the United States because of ongoing litigation over this stolen funds, which is estimated, I think, at 10 billion.
10 billion.
Some proportion of that is, I think, a U.S. district court has ruled has to be returned to the victims of the Marcos dictatorship. I'm not sure how the U.S. has legal jurisdiction here, but you know that's well beyond my purview. But because of this, Marcos Jr. can't actually travel to the United States. So his advisors have been very awkwardly dodging this question in media interviews in the last couple of days. And what that means for the alliance is very unclear. But you know, it's expected that Marcos or Bongbong will end the investigation within the Philippines into where those missing funds went. Remarkable that that investigation is still ongoing. It's no big mystery. His family had it. It's documented what assets the Marcoses, Imelda, and Ferdinand brought to the United States when they left to Hawaii in 1986. It was recorded what they brought with them in terms of stock options and stocks, as well as property they owned in New York City, like multiple skyscraper buildings. Just outrageous.
Yeah, dude, the Marcos shit, the way the U.S. handled that is like so fucking upsetting. And it's gonna get us sidetracked. I can't do it right now, but yeah, fuck. Yeah, the Philippines situation is not good, but it's not like it's the only situation that's not good. Like elite unaccountability is also a feature of American political life. So like, it's hard to throw stones, you know. Anyways, good discussion. It was like this armchair analysis was more topical than it was about the piece per se, I suppose. But nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, actually, I usually take notes on a piece, and I didn't this time, so it was just kind of couching discussion with reference to it.
Yeah.
You can delete that aside.
No. Oh, the only thing I would add before we move on to the next segment is that like this is a policy position thing. I think there's a lot that the U.S. can do to like create closer relations with the Philippines and to help the Philippines out of this political economic quandary. Like the Philippines has a lot of sovereign debt that the U.S. could forgive or restructure, right? There's a lot of shit that it could do strategically to help the Philippines economically, which would alleviate the incentives to go toward dictators like this, right? It's just that the U.S. doesn't think like this, so it's not doing it. But the thing that I would be hard line on is like, and this puts me on the opposite side of DC, we cannot be selling arms and providing military assistance to oligarchs, to kleptocrats. And like that goes too far. And especially when they're diverting their national budget toward defense, when it could be allocated toward other things, it does harm to them. And we're selling them things that don't help them fight China. Like they get a couple short range missiles and a squadron of fighters. Like they're not going to be able to defeat China in the South China Sea. I mean, like the operational concept for like how we're arming the Philippines does not exist yet. It's not sufficient to justify what we're doing, and it's certainly not sufficient to justify selling weapons to dictators. So like it doesn't look good for Bongbong because of who he is, but as he proves himself to be the person that we all know he seems to be, then we have to be prepared to suspend that. Right. And military assistance is a separate question technically from the alliance. But there's a principle there and has strategic consequences. And so like that is something that I'm probably going to end up saying a lot more in the future because I think it's a valid position, but nobody in DC stakes that out.
Well, Van, to play devil's advocate. Sorry, Gabby. I just want to push back on a couple points there. So firstly, if you look at Duterte's budget, the military modernization that the Philippines has wanted to do for some time since Aquino hasn't really taken place. And instead, what you see actually was Duterte doubling the budget for infrastructure as part of his Build, Build, Build program. It's like Build Back Better, but just build, build, build. I love that saying. And secondly,
yeah, but we created like $4 billion or 400. I can't remember what the amount was, but we did FMS, foreign military sales transactions to him where they paid us for weapon systems that don't help them fight China, even though that's the claim.
Well, we also gifted them Coast Guard vessels,
which they then have to staff and spend money on for maintenance. This is a thought through position. I mean, you can take it, you can disagree with it. I'm not going to like say you can't do that. That's valid. But like it's a thought through position, and it it commits structural violence to a country that can't afford to be in this position. So that's what I'm going to fill out more in the future. But yes,
Yeah.
I'm aware that it's on a like, this is not the vibe of like the CSISs who are on the Boeing and Lockheed team.
Yeah, and look, I don't want to go on this debate, but you say the Philippines can't afford to go in this direction. At the same time, I think, at this point, Philippines' national security is definitely at stake. I don't think that's really debatable. Chinese incursions in Philippine waters, have deprived Filipino fishermen of their ability to fish, and without some domestic deterrent, I don't see how the Philippines can continue to protect itself militarily to the extent that it's able to fish within its own waters.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's not a complicated issue, but if they're a dictatorship, you don't sell them fucking weapons. It's that simple. Their national security is not the security of the nation. It's the security of the 40 families. Like, national security doesn't benefit the mass if it's an oligarchy. If you're using national security as a misnomer to refer to the security of an elite system that's by and for elites. So there's a principle at stake here. And if they're not a dictatorship, you can have those concept arguments about the balance of power. You can talk about national security and that kind of thing because it's servicing a democracy. And this doesn't mean don't have close ties to them. It doesn't mean don't help them. It means center the people, right? And that's all. So there's a limitation. I think treating this in the traditional way is how we end up aiding kleptocracy in the world, which harms us net.
Sure. I would just say, in the case of the Philippines, I think the line between dictators and democrats is a fuzzy one. So, if this stuff took place under the Aquino administration as part of the EDCA agreement, which was signed in 2014, I'm not sure how it would more equitably provide the solutions that you're looking for from U.S. policy perspectives, just because he was seen as more of a champion of democracy and less of a dictator. Whereas, Duterte had a popular mandate. He was very popular after several years in office because of his infrastructure spending and seen as sort of, rightly or wrongly, the sort of political disruptor who was going to, respond to the poorer people's needs in the country.
And then he did lots of extrajudicial killings and suppressed free speech, which meant we should have suspended military assistance, right? Under the Leahy amendments, we were required to, and we didn't. Yep. So, yeah. Anyway,
China, continually, that's preventing us from being harsher to dictators.
Yes. All right. Glad we solved that one.
It will be an interesting ride ahead.
Yeah. All right. On to AMA.
Okay, for Ask Me Anything this week, you've got 5 questions. Are we doing all of them?
Yeah, I guess so. I can be quick, or I can try.
Okay, the first one is from Gabe from San Francisco, who says, you had a cryptic tweet the other day saying, of a screenshot of a tweet saying, quote, never sign up to attend a protest. What do you make of that statement?
Oh yeah, that tweet was viral. Like the woman who tweeted it, they went crazy, and a lot of people liked it. I mean, like hundreds of thousands of people, I think. And it strikes me that if you believe that you can't put your name on a list to join a protest, then you think we're already living in a fascist nightmare. And there's a way in which America's fascist, but it's not to the degree it's not black and white, first of all. So like, it's not to the degree that like, if you put your name on a protest list, you're fucked. Like, that's not the world we live in yet. That's the world we can end up in, right? Like, what's at stake with Black Lives Matter, with overturning Roe versus Wade, with rigging of like this stuff accumulates, and we can get into a world where like it is Handmaid's Tale, and you can't put your name on a protest list, right? But we're just not there yet. And it's what freaks me out a little bit is that like hundreds of thousands of people jumped on this tweet to say, yeah, when, and to do that indicates that they think we're already there. And I would at least like to believe that we're not there yet, you know? There's somebody made a comment too, that it was overwhelmingly like young people, Gen Z, who were like all on this tweet, like loving it. And so like the argument was, or the subtext that the lady was talking about was, I don't know how old she is, the lady, I don't know what, but she mentioned later that she was endorsing like flash mobs and black bloc, like basically like anti-fascist tactics. And that stuff has its uses, but like, I don't know, you're going to like create strategic change that way or like transform politics like that. And those tactics become like more necessary as fascism ratchets up. And so it's like, it just seems like we're not there yet. So like how you felt about the tweet was a referendum on what kind of world you think you're living in, I suppose. Yeah.
Cool. Next, we have Anonymous, who says, would love it if you guys would talk a bit about prospect theory and the risks of nuclear war with Putin.
Well, that's not going to be a quick one. So I guess like the 30-second version, prospect theory, you know, Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky won Nobel Prize for this, I think, in the 70s. And it was the concept, I actually teach it in security studies, but the concept is like, if a leader believes or a state believes that they're in a domain of losses, then they're more likely to take risks than if they were in a domain of gains. And everything hinges on like, well, what counts as being in a domain of gains versus losses. But the idea underlying it is just that we don't value what we have versus what we seek. We don't value those things equally. We value more what we already have, and we value more not losing what we have compared to seeking out extra. And so the idea, like when you apply prospect theory to IR, is very much that like, if you have a leader who's in a losing position or in that domain of losses mindset, it means that it's extra dangerous because it's risky. They're willing to do like throw the dice kind of shit. And so you don't want leaders or enemies who are in that mindset because they're going to do things that break rationality and risk escalation. And what I'm seeing from like the U.S. intelligence community, the stuff that they're saying is that Putin is basically in a domain of losses right now because he's literally losing in Ukraine. His strategy is such as it is like backfiring, and there's not really any way out except up. And that's trouble for us and for him. And so the concern here is that if the intelligence community is assessing Putin's mindset correctly, prospect theory would tell us we're all fucked. And by fucked, I mean nuclear war. And they have a nuclear doctrine, Russia does, that insists on first use, escalating to nuclear use before your enemy does, if you think that you're going to lose a conflict, right? And that's basically what's happening in Ukraine. So like, there's a way in which the Russia-US nuclear dyad is supposed to be stable. But if Putin's mindset as the decider for nuclear war is that like nuclear weapons use is the only prospect of him recovering the lost campaign in Ukraine, or keeping himself in power somehow, then we're super fucked. He's obviously going to do that. He doesn't give a shit, you know? And that seems like not a high likelihood of success, but if you're already going to lose, why not? You know? So I'm like very worried about this. And part of it comes from my understanding actually of prospect theory. So that's that in a nutshell.
Wow, that was a great little quick summary of it. Trini, a grad student at Louisiana State, says, "Love your show. I learned so much from it. But I'm wondering how often people on podcasts listen to podcasts. Do you have any recommendations?"
Yeah. Well, no. I mean, I'll just like I feel like I've been asked this question once upon a time. I'll go through real quick just shows that are in my shit right now, like on my phone. What's Left of Philosophy, A World to Win, Ben Burgess Give Them an Argument, The Moment with Brian Koppelman, who's the guy who wrote fucking Rounders, by the way, and Billions. Unclear and Present Danger with Jamel Bowie and John Gans. The Dig podcast is really fucking good. Block Party, which is a podcast that the Justice Democrats put out, but they like almost never update their episodes. Lawyers, Guns, and Money podcast. The People's Party with Talib Kweli. This Is Hell.
You listen to all of these?
Yeah, but like not, I mean, just only when I'm driving or whatever. So like I've got a backlog of things I haven't listened to. Left Anchor, Ezra Klein Show, Hell and High Water with John Heilman, Duck of Minerva podcast, Nostalgia Trap, Seneca, the Goop podcast with Gwyneth Paltrow. But I don't really listen to it very often. History of Ideas, Talking Politics, The Dave Chang Show, Whiskey and IR Theory, Undiplomatic, Know Your Enemy. Really good podcast for like understanding the right by leftists. Really good show. Armchair Expert with Dax Shepard, Tim Ferriss Show, Smodcast by Kevin Smith. Yeah, that's about it. Script Notes, which is like a screenwriting podcast. Yeah, that's it. That's a lot of shit.
That's a lot of podcasts.
Yeah.
That is a lot of
I listen to a
podcasts.
lot.
Do you guys have a favorite podcast?
This is my favorite
Yeah, this one's up there. I
Correct
really
answer.
like Pod Save the World.
podcast.
Pod Save the World.
This week I've been listening to a new or recent series by the History Channel about the Tulsa race riots or massacre of 1921, which is really well done. I highly recommend.
Oh. Wait, what's it called?
It's called Blind Spot. It's produced by the History Channel. And it's season 2. The first season was about 9/11. I haven't listened to, but season 2 is very good. I saw it recommended in some New York Times list of recent podcasts.
Interesting, yeah.
Also, shout out to Dan Carlin, Hardcore History. I'm a big fan of that one.
Yeah.
And the last mega series he did was on the rise of Imperial Japan in East Asia. I think it was a 6-part series called, what was it called? Red something or other.
What about Alex and Gabby? No?
So I don't really listen to podcasts that much. I'm more of a YouTube kind of person, but other than like Critical Role, the D&D thing, I watch I listen to Radio New Zealand's Red Line series, which is about Chinese influence in New Zealand, and that was a really good, like 4-part series. But yeah, podcast highlights I watch, but not really big episodes normally.
The irony of a Gen Z targeted podcast is that Gen Z doesn't listen to podcasts. They just watch
I
fucking
listened to
ads
this
on
one before I
YouTube.
was on it.
Yeah, I think I agree with Alex. I also listen to Critical Role. I have to edit NK News, so like I don't know if that counts as me listening to it.
That's right. Yeah.
But I feel like when I need to like switch off my brain because it's like, oh, it's a lot of politics, which is like not very academic-y of me to say. I feel like the only thing I've seen recently was this one guy who like reviewed the entirety of like, I don't know if like Alex or Celia have seen these shows, but you know like iCarly and Victoria's. I just watched like I just listened to like 8 hours of this guy critiquing this TV show. Yeah,
Oh my gosh.
so that's why I didn't want to say anything.
I never even heard of it. Oh my God. Okay. You guys make me feel old. All right, next question.
Okay, Trini also says, sorry, one more question. Hip hop. Do you listen to old school, or are there any new rappers you like? If you only listen to oldies, why?
I mostly listened to the olds because it was just way better, way better. The style of beats after trap music became part of hip hop, like early 2000s, the way music started sounding was fucking glitchy and like I was on fucking like had ADHD or some shit. And then the mumble rap is fucking embarrassing because they're literally not saying anything, right? So that's all a bunch of fucking bullshit. And so like the old shit had messages in it, like it was coming out of a particular place where everybody hadn't fucking sold out yet. But in the new rap, like Spotify feeds me into my daily mixes new shit based on what I liked. And so like I discovered Polo G recently out of Chicago, and he's fucking money. He murders it all the time. And then Juice World, who apparently dead,
Yeah.
but he's that
His
album is
music's
fucking
good.
sick. Yeah.
I like how you consider like your music. You're like, yeah, these guys are oldies. Like, is that
I've
what you
heard
consider them as? Or?
there's like the 90s playlist on Spotify is called like Golden Oldies of Hip Hop or some shit.
Oh,
But it's
shit.
like Tupac and Lupe Fiasco and Jay-Z, and I'm like this like
Yeah.
what?
The oldies are now mid 2000s.
Yeah. Like if it's
Ooh.
50 Cent, that's considered oldies.
Oh yeah, I feel like when they were having the what's it called, the NFL halftime show, you know, like Snoop Dogg and all that sort of thing. I saw some like younger people than me being like, "Who are these guys?" And I'm like, "Stop, stop."
That's
That
embarrassing.
shit hurts.
Imagine not knowing Snoop Dogg at least. Come on.
Yeah, he's like a cultural figure at least.
Stewart absolutely killing the game.
Yeah.
Okay, last question is a little bit more serious. It's from Anonymous, and it says, how do you evaluate what's going on in Ukraine when it comes to military strategy? You mentioned something a while back about power projection and the offense-defense balance on Twitter.
Man, might need to like pace these questions differently in the future. This is like such a shift from the last question. Jesus, I can't even get back into the mindset of this. What was the question again? Power projection?
Yeah, it was how do you evaluate what's
fucking
going
Polo G. Sorry.
Yeah, we'll change it next time. This one says, how do you evaluate what's going on in Ukraine when it comes to military strategy? You mentioned something a while back about power projection and the offense-defense balance.
Okay, so short version, I guess, is that one thing that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is proving was that, like, when you were looking at the balance of forces, it obviously favored Russia. The problem, and that Russia's running into, is that it's it's an away game. Like it's foreign turf. Foreign turf always favors the defender. Like it's their territory. It's closer. They don't have to move logistics as far. They don't have to project power as far. They know the terrain better. They have more resolve because it's their existence on the line, right? So like the offense-defense balance tilts toward the defender, all else being equal most of the time. But there's also like the available technologies of the day affect the offense-defense balance too, right? So we live in a world now. This is like a weird thing that's like not resolved, or it's still up for debate. But we live in a world now that's like awash in aerial surveillance, basically cyber attacks and electronic warfare and missiles. So like, what does that terrain like how does that terrain tilt in relative to the offense-defense balance, right? If it tilts toward offense, then it's a world where revanchist great power like Russia might have some serious advantages in doing blitzkrieg Nazi Germany type shit and going on the offense and trying to conquer quickly, right? But I suspect, and I think this is what Ukraine is showing us, is that like, well, no, the defender still has the advantage, right? Power projection has never been easy. And that means that like, if you're a defender and if you're a small state, as long as you're defending things that are local to you, you're safer than you think from great power predation, right? And so like I'm thinking specifically of like Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific Islands and even Japan, like you're defending your home turf against fears of like Chinese encroachment, even a future Chinese boogeyman version of the PLA that doesn't quite exist yet. You have advantages, and Ukraine is showing that like you maybe don't need to be super freaked out in an arms race, and the US should recognize that too. The way we think about this stuff, we like build up China to be 10 feet tall, and it's not, and the things that we're trying to defend, we think about defending it from our position, which is superpower projection into Asia. But what about the local powers' ability to defend, which is much greater than our ability to project power? So like if we were less egocentric about this and we thought more about like forward balancing and the frontline states taking the burden of responsibility for their own defense, like shit might work out a lot more favorably. Conquest is a lot harder than I think we imagine. And so all of that is, you can stretch the analogy too far, but like all of that is being evidenced in Ukraine, I feel like. And it's just a reminder of classical insight that like defense tends to have the advantage in these things. All right.
It does help to be fighting 50-year-old tech with stuff the US military has barely been supplied yet.
Yeah. No, I knew that the US was like funneling. The US was providing them targeting intelligence when they were using like smart drone footage to show them blowing up like Russian generals and shit. It's like, you think the Ukrainians are doing that completely on their own? Like, get the fuck out of here, Yeah. That's another issue. Another reason why I'm afraid of nuclear war, though, because we're obviously way more involved than like what we were initially claiming we were. Okay. So is that it? All right. Pretty comprehensive episode. Jesus. All right, gang, that's going to do it. buymeacoffee.com/undiplomatic to buy us coffees, and cottonbureau.com. Search Undiplomatic for the merch. And we're on YouTube. Search Undiplomatic Podcast and subscribe, like, all that good stuff. All right. Catch you next time. Peace. All right, guys.
Ooh, fun.
Good episode.
Oh, damn. I didn't realize Juice WRLD like died in like 2019. That's ages. Like,
he
he's still,
died
like,
before that
chugging
big
music.
album, the one that has like cotton
Yeah.
candy looking picture. Like
It's
that,
a trip. That's my
that
favorite
album,
one.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's that street life, man. Stay off. All right, guys.
Just on segment of on music.
Right?
Good.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Main
Thank
Street
you.
and
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Andra.